Marcus stood in the corporate boardroom, watching his colleague James deliver what should have been Marcus's presentation. 6 months of research, sleepless nights, and innovative solutions now flowed from James's mouth as if they were his own creation. The executives nodded approvingly, completely unaware of the theft that had just occurred before their eyes. Marcus felt the familiar burn of betrayal, but this time something was different. This time, he remembered the words of Niccolò Machiavelli: "Everyone sees what you appear to be, few experience what you really are." This moment would become Marcus's awakening to a fundamental truth about human nature and workplace dynamics. The world is filled with toxic people who manipulate, deceive, and destroy others to advance their own interests. These individuals operate by a different set of rules that most decent people refuse to acknowledge or learn. But Machiavelli understood something that modern society often tries to ignore: sometimes you must fight fire with fire, not to become like your enemies, but to protect yourself and those you care about. The transformation of weak individuals into powerful ones begins with a single realization: toxic people succeed because they exploit the good nature of others. They count on your honesty, your trust, and your reluctance to engage in their games. They weaponize your virtues against you, turning your strengths into vulnerabilities. But what happens when you understand their playbook? What happens when you learn to speak their language while maintaining your core integrity? You become unstoppable. The anatomy of toxic manipulation. Sarah had always prided herself on being a team player. As a project manager at a growing tech company, she believed in collaboration, transparency, and giving credit where credit was due. These qualities had served her well in previous positions, but they made her an easy target for David, the company's VP of operations. David possessed an almost supernatural ability to make others doubt themselves while simultaneously positioning himself as their savior. The manipulation began subtly. During team meetings, David would ask Sarah pointed questions about her project timelines, framing them as helpful inquiries while actually undermining her credibility. He would say things like, "Sarah, I'm just trying to understand why this is taking so long. I'm not criticizing, just want to help you succeed." The statement contained multiple psychological hooks. It positioned him as supportive while implying she was behind schedule, made her defensive responses seem ungrateful, and created doubt in the minds of other attendees. Machiavelli observed that men judge generally more by the eye than by the hand, for everyone can see and few can feel. Everyone sees what you appear to be, few experience what you really are. David understood this principle intuitively. To outside observers, he appeared helpful and engaged. Only Sarah experienced the systematic erosion of her confidence and reputation. The toxic playbook follows predictable patterns that Machiavelli would have recognized immediately. First comes the assessment phase, where toxic individuals identify potential targets. They look for people who are competent enough to be useful but compassionate enough to be manipulated. They seek individuals with strong moral codes, as these people are less likely to fight back using underhanded tactics. Next comes the grooming phase, where the toxic person establishes themselves as an ally or mentor. They offer help, share confidences, and create a sense of special connection. This phase is crucial because it establishes the foundation for future manipulation. The target begins to trust the toxic person and becomes invested in maintaining the relationship. The exploitation phase follows, where the toxic individual begins to extract value from the relationship. This might involve taking credit for the target's work, gathering information to use against them later, or simply using them as an emotional dumping ground. The key is that this exploitation increases gradually, allowing the target to adjust and normalize increasingly unacceptable behavior. Throughout this process, toxic people employ several consistent tactics. They use gaslighting to make their targets question their own perceptions and memories. They employ triangulation, bringing third parties into conflicts to create confusion and divided loyalties. They practice selective empathy, showing understanding and compassion only when it serves their purposes. The Machiavellian response: fighting fire with fire. When Marcus walked out of that boardroom, he made a decision that would change his career trajectory forever. Instead of complaining to HR or confronting James directly, he began to study his enemy. He observed James's patterns, identified his weaknesses, and started to understand the ecosystem that allowed such behavior to flourish. Machiavelli wrote, "Since love and fear can hardly exist together, if we must choose between them, it is far safer to be feared than loved." Marcus realized that his mistake had been trying to be loved by everyone, including those who sought his kindness as weakness. He needed to become someone who could not be easily dismissed or exploited. The first principle of the Machiavellian response is strategic thinking. While toxic people often operate on impulse and emotion, their targets must learn to think several moves ahead. This means understanding not just what toxic individuals want, but why they want it and how they plan to get it. It means recognizing patterns and predicting behavior based on past actions rather than stated intentions. Marcus began documenting every interaction with James. He kept detailed records of emails, meeting notes, and project contributions. When James tried to claim credit for ideas in subsequent meetings, Marcus was ready. He would say things like, "That's an interesting perspective, James. It reminds me of the approach I outlined in my email from last Tuesday. Would you like me to forward that to the team for reference?" The statement was polite and professional, but it served notice that Marcus was paying attention and keeping records. The second principle is emotional detachment. Toxic people thrive on emotional reactions because emotions cloud judgment and make people predictable. When someone is angry, hurt, or defensive, they make mistakes that can be exploited. The Machiavellian approach requires learning to control emotional responses and use them strategically rather than reactively. Sarah learned this lesson the hard way during one of David's public interrogations. Instead of becoming defensive as usual, she paused, smiled slightly, and said, "That's a great question, David. I'd love to discuss the project details with you offline so we can dive deep into the specifics without boring everyone else with the technical details." This response accomplished several things. It acknowledged his question without answering it publicly, positioned her as considerate of others' time, and forced him to either drop the subject or reveal his true intention to embarrass her publicly. The third principle is leverage. Toxic people understand that power comes from having something others want or need. They position themselves as gatekeepers, information brokers, or indispensable team members. To counter this, their targets must develop their own sources of leverage. This might involve building relationships with key decision makers, developing unique skills, or simply becoming too valuable to lose. Marcus began cultivating relationships throughout the organization. He made a point of helping colleagues with their projects, sharing useful information, and being genuinely supportive. Unlike James, who helped others only when it served his immediate interests, Marcus built a network of people who genuinely valued his contributions. When the time came for the next promotion cycle, Marcus had allies in multiple departments while James had only his immediate supervisor. The art of strategic patience. One of the most difficult aspects of implementing Machiavellian tactics against toxic people is the requirement for patience. Toxic individuals often get immediate gratification from their manipulations, while their targets must play a longer game. This disparity can be frustrating, especially when you're watching someone succeed through underhanded means while you're building foundations that may not pay off for months or years. Elena discovered this truth while dealing with her toxic business partner, Rachel. Rachel had a gift for making grand promises to clients while leaving Elena to handle the practical implementation. When projects inevitably ran into complications, Rachel would distance herself from the problems while positioning Elena as the source of delays and difficulties. The pattern was clear: Rachel got the glory while Elena got the blame. The immediate response would have been to confront Rachel directly or to start playing the same games. But Machiavelli understood that there is nothing more difficult to take in hand, more perilous to conduct, or more uncertain in its success than to take the lead in the introduction of a new order of things. Change requires careful planning and perfect timing. Elena began what she privately called the documentation project. She started recording client conversations, saving all email communications, and creating detailed project timelines. She also began subtly educating clients about the complexity of their projects and the realistic timelines involved. Instead of making excuses when problems arose, she would reference her previous communications and demonstrate how she had anticipated and prepared for these challenges. The turning point came when a major client's project hit a significant obstacle that Rachel had dismissed as trivial during the sales process. Elena was ready with documentation showing her warnings about this exact issue, along with several proposed solutions she had developed proactively. When Rachel tried to shift blame, Elena simply forwarded the email chain to the client, saying, "As you can see from my message dated 6 weeks ago, we anticipated this challenge and developed several contingency plans. Shall we discuss which approach works best for your timeline and budget?" This moment illustrated another crucial Machiavellian principle: letting your enemies destroy themselves. Rachel's credibility with the client evaporated not because Elena attacked her, but because Elena had prepared for the inevitable moment when Rachel's promises would collide with reality. The client saw clearly who had been managing the project responsibly and who had been making unrealistic commitments. The psychology of power dynamics. Understanding toxic behavior requires recognizing the psychological drivers that motivate such people. Machiavelli observed human nature with clinical precision, noting that men are so simple and so much inclined to obey immediate needs that a deceiver will never lack victims for his deceptions. Toxic individuals succeed because they understand and exploit fundamental human psychology. Tom learned this lesson while dealing with his department head, Linda, who had perfected the art of public humiliation disguised as professional development. Linda would wait until team meetings to point out mistakes, ask embarrassing questions, or challenge decisions in ways that made her subordinates look incompetent. She justified this behavior as keeping everyone sharp and maintaining high standards. The psychology behind Linda's behavior was complex but predictable. She needed to maintain her position as the smartest person in the room, which required making others appear less competent by comparison. She also fed off the emotional energy of her victims' discomfort, confusion, and fear. Understanding these motivations gave Tom insight into how to counter them. Instead of trying to avoid Linda's attacks or defend against them reactively, Tom began preparing for them. He anticipated the questions she might ask and prepared thoughtful responses. When she challenged his decisions, he would acknowledge her points respectfully while providing additional context that demonstrated his thorough consideration of the issues. Most importantly, he began documenting these interactions and sharing summaries with team members who had witnessed them. The documentation served multiple purposes. It protected Tom from gaslighting attempts where Linda might later claim conversations had gone differently than they actually had. It also created a record of her behavior pattern that could be shared with HR or senior management if necessary. But, perhaps most importantly, it demonstrated to his colleagues that he was taking a professional approach to a difficult situation. Building alliances and networks. Machiavelli emphasized the importance of alliances. He who neglects what is done for what ought to be done, sooner affects his ruin than his preservation. In dealing with toxic people, isolation is death. They excel at divide and conquer tactics, turning potential allies against each other and leaving their targets friendless and vulnerable. Jennifer faced this challenge when dealing with her supervisor, Mark, who had a talent for creating conflict between team members. He would share confidential information selectively, give contradictory instructions to different people, and then act surprised when conflicts arose. His favorite tactic was the concerned manager routine, where he would express worry about one employee's performance to another, creating suspicion and undermining team cohesion. Jennifer's response was to become obsessively transparent. When Mark shared confidential information about a colleague's performance, Jennifer would immediately contact that colleague to discuss the situation directly. When he gave her instructions that contradicted what he had told others, she would arrange team meetings to clarify expectations for everyone. She transformed his weapon of division into a tool for unity. This approach required courage because it meant risking Mark's anger and potential retaliation. But Jennifer understood that the greater risk lay in allowing him to continue isolating team members from each other. By forcing transparency and communication, she neutralized his ability to manipulate information and relationships. The alliance-building process requires genuine value creation for others. Unlike toxic people who use relationships purely for extraction, Machiavellian strategy involves creating win-win scenarios that build lasting loyalty. Jennifer began organizing team lunches, sharing useful resources with colleagues, and volunteering to help with challenging projects. She built a network based on mutual support rather than fear or obligation. The mirror technique, reflecting toxic behavior. One of the most powerful tools in the Machiavellian arsenal is the mirror technique, where you reflect toxic behavior back to its source in a way that exposes their tactics without descending to their level. This approach requires significant skill and emotional control, but it can be devastatingly effective. Robert discovered this technique while dealing with his business partner, Kevin, who had a habit of making important decisions unilaterally and then presenting them as team choices. Kevin would say things like, "We've decided to change our marketing strategy," when he had actually made the decision alone and was using the plural pronoun to avoid responsibility and create the illusion of consensus. Robert's response was elegant in its simplicity. He began using the same language patterns in reverse. When Kevin announced their decisions, Robert would respond with genuine curiosity, "That's interesting, Kevin. I don't remember being part of that discussion. Could you help me understand the decision-making process we used?" The question was polite and professional, but it forced Kevin to either admit he had made the decision unilaterally or fabricate a story about consultation that never happened. The beauty of the mirror technique is that it allows toxic people to experience their own behavior from the receiving end. When Kevin tried to gaslight Robert by claiming they had discussed the decision when they hadn't, Robert would simply ask for specific details. "I want to make sure I understand correctly. When did we have this conversation? I'd like to review my notes to make sure I captured all the key points." This forced Kevin to either provide details he couldn't fabricate or acknowledge that the conversation hadn't occurred. The information warfare strategy Machiavelli understood that information is power, and controlling information flow is a key element of political success. Toxic people excel at information warfare, using selective disclosure, misinformation, and strategic silence to maintain advantages over their targets. Learning to counter these tactics requires developing your own information strategy. Patricia learned this lesson while dealing with her coworker, Steve, who had access to senior management and used that access to position himself as an insider with special knowledge. Steve would drop hints about upcoming changes, share partial information about management decisions, and generally create the impression that he was more connected and informed than his colleagues. He used this perceived insider status to gain influence and make others feel dependent on him for crucial information. Patricia's counter-strategy involved developing her own information networks while exposing the limitations of Steve's knowledge. She began building relationships with people in different departments, attending optional company meetings, and reading all available company communications. She discovered that much of Steve's insider information was actually available to everyone who took the time to look for it. When Steve would share his supposed insider knowledge, Patricia would respond with additional context or ask probing questions that revealed the gaps in his understanding. She would say things like, "That's interesting, Steve. I saw in the quarterly report that they're also considering option B. How do you think that factors into their decision-making process?" This approach demonstrated her own knowledge while exposing the incomplete nature of his information. The information warfare strategy extends beyond simply gathering facts. It involves understanding how information flows through an organization, who has real influence versus who appears to have influence, and how to position yourself as a valuable source of accurate information rather than speculation and gossip. The long game, patience and persistence. Perhaps the most challenging aspect of implementing Machiavellian strategies against toxic people is maintaining focus on long-term objectives while enduring short-term frustrations. Toxic individuals often get immediate gratification from their manipulations, while their targets must invest time and energy in strategies that may not pay off for months or years. David learned this lesson during his 2-year campaign to neutralize his toxic colleague, Maria, who had systematically undermined 3 previous team members until they transferred to other departments or left the company entirely. Maria's tactics were sophisticated and subtle. She would volunteer to help with projects and, then, create small problems that made her colleagues look unreliable. She would offer to take on additional responsibilities and, then, claim she was being overworked when deadlines approached. She had perfected the art of creating plausible deniability while consistently sabotaging others' success. David's response required extraordinary patience and discipline. Instead of trying to expose Maria's behavior directly, he focused on building his own reputation for reliability and competence. He documented every interaction, delivered on every commitment, and gradually built a network of supporters who had experienced his consistent professionalism. The breakthrough came during a major project where Maria volunteered to handle a critical component. David quietly developed a backup plan, anticipating that Maria would create problems at the last minute. When she did exactly that, claiming unexpected complications that would delay the entire project, David was ready with his alternative solution. He presented it not as an indictment of Maria's work, but as a contingency plan he had developed just in case they encountered any obstacles. This moment demonstrated the power of preparation and patience. David didn't attack Maria directly or try to expose her sabotage. Instead, he positioned himself as someone who anticipated problems and developed solutions. The contrast between his preparation and her crisis creation became obvious to everyone involved. The ethical foundation, maintaining integrity while fighting fire with fire. The most important aspect of implementing Machiavellian strategies against toxic people is maintaining your ethical foundation while learning to speak their language. The goal is not to become like them, but to protect yourself and others from their harmful behavior. This requires constant vigilance against the temptation to abandon your principles in pursuit of victory. Machiavelli himself struggled with this balance, writing about the tension between effectiveness and morality in leadership. He observed that there are two ways of fighting, one with laws, the other with force. The first way is natural to men, and the second to beasts. But, as the first way often proves inadequate, one must have recourse to the second. Lisa faced this ethical challenge while dealing with her supervisor, James, who had created a hostile work environment through consistent bullying, public humiliation, and professional sabotage. Her natural inclination was to maintain her professional demeanor and hope that his behavior would eventually be addressed by senior management. But, after watching two talented colleagues leave the company because of James's treatment, she realized that passive endurance was enabling continued harm to others. Lisa's approach involved strategic documentation and careful escalation rather than direct retaliation. She began keeping detailed records of James's behavior, including dates, witnesses, and specific examples of policy violations. She connected with other team members who had experienced similar treatment and encouraged them to document their experiences as well. Most importantly, she researched company policies and procedures to ensure her response would be procedurally correct and difficult to dismiss. The key was framing her actions as professional problem-solving rather than personal vendetta. When she finally approached HR with her documented evidence, she presented it as a business issue affecting team productivity and employee retention rather than a personality conflict. She included specific examples of how James's behavior had impacted project deliverables, team morale, and the company's ability to retain talent. This approach succeeded because it aligned with organizational interests rather than appearing to be personal grievance. Lisa had learned to fight fire with fire by using systematic documentation, policy knowledge, and strategic thinking while maintaining her ethical foundation and focusing on protecting others rather than seeking revenge. The Machiavellian approach to dealing with toxic people is ultimately about power dynamics and strategic thinking. It requires understanding that some people operate by different rules and that dealing with them effectively sometimes requires adopting their tactical sophistication while maintaining your moral clarity. The man who destroys his weak self, the self that enables manipulation through excessive trust, emotional reactivity, and strategic naivety, becomes impossible for others to destroy because he has learned to protect himself without becoming what he fights against. The conference room fell silent as Rachel presented her quarterly results, each metric representing a small victory in her 2-year campaign against her manipulative colleague, Derek. 18 months earlier, Derek had systematically dismantled her credibility with surgical precision, turning her team against her through whisper campaigns and selective information sharing. Now, as she looked at the faces around the table, she saw respect where there had once been doubt, confidence where there had been confusion. The transformation from victim to victor doesn't happen overnight. It requires a fundamental shift in how you view yourself, your relationships, and the rules of engagement in professional and personal environments. Machiavelli understood that men judge generally more by the eye than by the hand, meaning that perception often matters more than reality. Derek had manipulated perceptions expertly, but Rachel had learned to do the same thing more effectively and ethically. The first stage of transformation involves what psychologists call learned helplessness recovery. Many targets of toxic behavior develop a mindset where they believe they have no control over their situation. They accept abuse as inevitable and focus their energy on minimizing damage rather than eliminating the threat. This mindset must be completely rewired before any strategic response becomes possible. Rachel's breakthrough moment came during a team meeting where Derek was performing his usual routine of undermining her project updates with seemingly helpful questions that highlighted potential problems. Instead of becoming defensive as usual, Rachel paused, smiled, and said, "That's an excellent point, Derek. You always identify the critical issues. Since you have such insight into these challenges, would you be willing to take the lead on developing solutions? I'd love to leverage your expertise." The request was perfectly reasonable and professional, but it exposed Derek's game. He either had to contribute actual value to the project or reveal that his helpful questions were actually designed to create problems rather than solve them. This moment taught Rachel a crucial lesson about the psychology of toxic behavior. People like Derek succeed because they position themselves as critics without taking responsibility for solutions. They point out flaws, raise concerns, and identify problems, but they rarely volunteer to fix anything. This allows them to appear engaged and thoughtful while actually being parasitic on the efforts of others. The art of strategic positioning. Understanding toxic behavior requires recognizing that these individuals are constantly engaged in strategic positioning. They think several moves ahead, anticipate responses to their actions, and position themselves to benefit regardless of outcomes. Learning to counter this requires developing your own strategic thinking capabilities and understanding the larger game being played. Michael discovered this reality while dealing with his business partner, Sandra, who had perfected the art of taking credit for successes while distancing herself from failures. Sandra would involve herself heavily in projects that showed early promise while gradually disengaging from those that encountered difficulties. She had an uncanny ability to position herself as the visionary behind successful initiatives while making others appear responsible for any setbacks. Michael's response required understanding Sandra's positioning strategies and developing countermoves that exposed her patterns without appearing vindictive. He began documenting the lifecycle of every project, including who was involved at each stage, what decisions were made, and how responsibilities evolved over time. More importantly, he started sharing these project summaries with stakeholders throughout the process, creating a real-time record that couldn't be revised retroactively. The technique Michael developed became known among his colleagues as transparent leadership. Before each project meeting, he would circulate an agenda that included previous decisions, current status, and specific action items with assigned owners. During meetings, he would summarize key decisions and send follow-up emails confirming what had been agreed upon. This level of documentation made it nearly impossible for Sandra to later claim different levels of involvement or responsibility. The strategic positioning battle also involves understanding the ecosystem in which toxic people operate. They rarely work alone, instead, they cultivate networks of enablers, supporters, and unwitting accomplices. Sandra's success depended partly on senior management who valued her apparent ability to be involved in successful projects while remaining uninvolved in failures. Michael's documentation strategy gradually revealed this pattern to executives who had previously seen Sandra as an effective leader. The counter-manipulation playbook. Effective counter-manipulation requires understanding the specific tactics that toxic people use and developing precise responses to each one. This isn't about becoming manipulative yourself, it's about neutralizing manipulation through strategic awareness and response preparation. Elena learned this lesson while dealing with her supervisor, Robert, who used a technique called triangulation to maintain control over his team. Robert would share confidential information about one team member with others, creating suspicion and competition rather than collaboration. He would tell Elena about concerns regarding her colleague Mark's performance, then share different concerns about Elena with Mark. This kept team members focused on each other rather than questioning Robert's leadership. Elena's counter-strategy involved what she called radical transparency. When Robert shared concerns about Mark's work, Elena would say, "I appreciate you sharing this with me, Robert. Since these concerns affect our team's effectiveness, shall we discuss them with Mark directly so we can all work together on solutions?" This response consistently forced Robert to either have honest conversations with team members or reveal that his concerns were designed to create division rather than solve problems. The counter-manipulation playbook also includes responses to gaslighting, which is perhaps the most insidious form of psychological manipulation. Gaslighting involves making victims question their own perceptions, memories, and sanity. Toxic people excel at this because they understand that confused, self-doubting individuals are easier to control and less likely to seek help or fight back. James experienced systematic gaslighting from his colleague, Patricia, who would deny conversations they'd had, claim he had misunderstood clearly stated agreements, and suggest that his memory of events was unreliable. The gaslighting was so consistent and sophisticated that James began to doubt his own recollections and became hesitant to trust his judgment in professional situations. James's recovery began with what he called external validation systems. He started taking notes during every conversation with Patricia, sending follow-up emails summarizing what had been discussed, and copying other colleagues on important communications. When Patricia later claimed that conversations had gone differently than James remembered, he had documentation to reference. More importantly, the documentation was visible to others, making it difficult for Patricia to dismiss his version of events as faulty memory. The psychology of toxic enablement. One of the most frustrating aspects of dealing with toxic people is discovering how many others enable their behavior, either through active support or passive acceptance. Understanding why good people enable toxic behavior is crucial for developing effective strategies to counter it. Margaret learned this lesson while attempting to address the behavior of her department head, Charles, who created a culture of fear through public humiliation, impossible deadlines, and favoritism based on personal loyalty rather than professional competence. Margaret initially assumed that other team members shared her concerns and would support efforts to address Charles's behavior. Instead, she discovered a complex web of enablement that kept the toxic system functioning. Some colleagues enabled Charles because they benefited from his favoritism and feared losing their privileged status. Others had become so demoralized that they couldn't imagine change was possible and viewed any resistance as futile and potentially dangerous. Still others genuinely believed that Charles's demanding style was necessary for maintaining high performance standards, even though data showed that team productivity and retention had declined significantly under his leadership. Margaret's approach required addressing each type of enablement differently. For colleagues who benefited from favoritism, she focused on demonstrating how the toxic environment ultimately undermined everyone's success by reducing overall team effectiveness. For demoralized team members, she provided examples of successful resistance and change in other organizations, helping them develop hope that improvement was possible. For true believers in Charles's methods, she presented performance data that contradicted their assumptions about his effectiveness. The enablement system also included senior management who valued Charles's apparent results while remaining unaware of the costs associated with his methods. Margaret began tracking metrics that revealed these hidden costs: employee turnover, sick days, project delays caused by people avoiding communication with Charles, and the time spent managing conflicts created by his divisive leadership style. Advanced psychological tactics. As you develop proficiency in countering toxic behavior, you'll discover advanced psychological tactics that can be devastatingly effective when used ethically and strategically. These techniques require significant skill and emotional control, but they can neutralize even highly sophisticated toxic individuals. One of the most powerful advanced tactics is what psychologists call reverse psychology manipulation exposure. This involves using the toxic person's own psychological patterns against them while maintaining complete ethical integrity. David mastered this technique while dealing with his colleague, Lisa, who used guilt manipulation and false victimhood to control team dynamics. Lisa would consistently volunteer for projects and, then, claim to be overwhelmed, creating guilt in others who would then take on additional work to help her. She would make commitments she couldn't keep and, then, explain her failures as the result of others not supporting her adequately. The pattern was sophisticated because it positioned her as both helpful, volunteering for work, and victimized, overwhelmed and unsupported, making it difficult for colleagues to criticize her without appearing unsympathetic. David's response involved what he privately called enthusiastic support. When Lisa volunteered for projects, David would enthusiastically agree while immediately asking for her detailed project plan, timeline, and resource requirements. When she claimed to be overwhelmed, he would express concern and offer specific help, asking exactly which tasks she needed assistance with and when. When she made commitments, he would follow up regularly to check on progress and offer support for any challenges she was experiencing. This approach was psychologically devastating for Lisa because it eliminated the wiggle room her manipulation required. She couldn't claim to be unsupported when David was offering specific help. She couldn't blame others for her failures when David was checking on her progress and offering assistance. She couldn't play the victim when David was being genuinely supportive and helpful. The information advantage. Machiavelli understood that information is the foundation of all power, and this principle applies directly to dealing with toxic people. They succeed partly because they control information flow, selectively sharing and withholding details to maintain advantages over their targets. Developing your own information advantages is crucial for evening the playing field. Stephen learned this lesson while dealing with his supervisor, Karen, who used information hoarding as a control mechanism. Karen would withhold crucial project details until the last minute, share different information with different team members, and generally create confusion that made her appear indispensable while making others appear disorganized and unprepared. Stephen's response involved developing multiple information sources and becoming obsessively proactive about gathering details. He built relationships with people in other departments who had insights into projects affecting his work. He attended optional meetings, read all available company communications, and generally made himself into an information hub rather than remaining dependent on Karen's selective sharing. The breakthrough came during a major project where Karen had been withholding crucial client requirements, apparently planning to share them at the last minute to create a crisis that would require her heroic intervention. Stephen had independently gathered the same information through his network and had quietly prepared his team for the requirements. When Karen finally revealed the surprise requirements, Stephen was able to respond immediately with solutions, making her appear to be creating unnecessary drama rather than managing genuine emergencies. This experience taught Stephen that information advantages compound over time. Each piece of knowledge you gather independently reduces your dependence on toxic individuals who use information control as a manipulation tool. More importantly, it positions you as someone who is well-informed and prepared rather than reactive and dependent. The network effect. Toxic people often succeed because they isolate their targets, making them feel alone and unsupported in their struggles. One of the most effective counter-strategies involves building networks of mutual support that provide both practical assistance and psychological validation. Jennifer learned this lesson while dealing with workplace bullying from her colleague, Mark, who used public humiliation and professional sabotage to maintain dominance over perceived threats. Mark's strategy involved making Jennifer appear incompetent and unreliable while positioning himself as the solution to problems he had created. Jennifer's response involved systematically building relationships with colleagues across multiple departments. She began offering genuine help to others, sharing useful resources and information, and generally making herself valuable to people throughout the organization. This wasn't manipulation, it was strategic relationship building based on mutual benefit and genuine support. The network Jennifer built served multiple functions. It provided her with allies who had witnessed her professional competence and reliability, making Mark's attempts to undermine her credibility less effective. It gave her access to information and resources that reduced her dependence on Mark's cooperation. Most importantly, it provided psychological support that helped her maintain confidence and perspective during difficult periods. The network effect also works in reverse, gradually isolating toxic individuals as more people recognize their destructive patterns. When Jennifer's colleagues began comparing notes about their experiences with Mark, they discovered consistent patterns of manipulation and sabotage that had been hidden when each person dealt with Mark individually. This collective awareness made it much more difficult for Mark to continue his divisive tactics. The timing factor. One of the most crucial elements of successfully countering toxic people is understanding timing. Machiavelli emphasized the importance of timing in political action, noting that there is nothing more difficult to take in hand, more perilous to conduct, or more uncertain in its success than to take the lead in the introduction of a new order of things. Patricia learned this lesson during her campaign to address the toxic behavior of her department head, William, who had created a culture of fear and favoritism that was destroying team morale and productivity. Patricia's initial attempts to address the situation failed because she acted impulsively when emotions were high rather than strategically when conditions were optimal. The turning point came when Patricia learned to wait for the right moment to take action. Instead of responding immediately to William's provocations, she began documenting patterns and waiting for opportunities when her concerns would be most likely to receive serious attention. The optimal moment arrived when the company was conducting its annual employee satisfaction survey and several high-performing team members had recently left the organization. Patricia used this moment to present a carefully documented analysis of team performance under William's leadership, including retention data, productivity metrics, and specific examples of behavior that violated company policies. The timing was perfect because senior management was already focused on employee satisfaction and retention issues, making them more receptive to addressing leadership problems that contributed to these challenges. Understanding timing also involves recognizing when not to act. Sometimes the best response to toxic behavior is strategic patience, allowing toxic individuals to expose themselves through their own actions rather than forcing confrontations when conditions aren't favorable for success. The psychological warfare mindset. Developing the ability to counter sophisticated toxic behavior requires adopting what military strategists call a psychological warfare mindset. This doesn't mean becoming cruel or manipulative, it means understanding that you're engaged in a battle for psychological territory and that traditional rules of engagement may not apply. Thomas learned this lesson while dealing with his business partner, Rebecca, who used emotional manipulation and guilt tactics to control business decisions and extract unfair advantages from their partnership. Rebecca would create emotional crises around important decisions, use personal information against Thomas, and generally weaponize their personal relationship to gain business advantages. Thomas's response required emotional detachment and strategic thinking that felt uncomfortable initially because it went against his natural inclination to maintain harmony in personal relationships. He began treating Rebecca's emotional manipulations as tactical moves in a larger game rather than genuine expressions of feeling. When she would create emotional crises around business decisions, Thomas would acknowledge her feelings while insisting on addressing business issues through objective analysis rather than emotional pressure. The psychological warfare mindset also involves understanding that toxic people often escalate their behavior when their usual tactics stop working. Thomas had to prepare for Rebecca's escalation attempts, which included threatening to dissolve the partnership, attempting to turn mutual friends against him, and trying to create guilt by claiming that his resistance to her manipulation was damaging their personal relationship. Thomas's preparation for escalation proved crucial when Rebecca began threatening legal action to force business decisions that favored her interests. Because Thomas had anticipated this possibility, he had already documented their partnership agreements, gathered evidence of Rebecca's manipulative behavior, and consulted with legal counsel about his options. Rebecca's threats lost their power because Thomas was prepared for them. The long-term victory strategy. Perhaps the most important aspect of successfully countering toxic people is understanding that victory often comes not through dramatic confrontations but through consistent, patient implementation of superior strategies over extended periods. Toxic people succeed through persistence and consistency in their destructive behavior. Countering them requires even greater persistence and consistency in constructive responses. Elizabeth learned this lesson during her 3-year campaign to neutralize her toxic colleague, Richard, who had systematically destroyed the careers of 4 previous team members through character assassination, professional sabotage, and political manipulation. Richard's tactics were sophisticated and had been refined through years of successful implementation. Elizabeth's victory strategy involved becoming absolutely excellent at her job while simultaneously documenting Richard's behavior patterns and building a network of allies who could witness his destructive tactics. She didn't try to expose Richard directly or engage in public confrontations. Instead, she focused on becoming indispensable to the organization while creating conditions that would eventually make Richard's behavior impossible to ignore or excuse. The victory came not through a single dramatic moment but through a gradual shift in organizational perception. Over time, Elizabeth's consistent excellence and professional behavior contrasted sharply with Richard's divisive tactics and questionable contributions. When budget cuts required the organization to make difficult personnel decisions, the choice between keeping Elizabeth and keeping Richard was obvious to everyone except Richard himself. This experience taught Elizabeth that the most sustainable victories against toxic people come from building something better rather than simply tearing down what they've built. By focusing on creating value, building relationships, and demonstrating excellence, she positioned herself as someone the organization couldn't afford to lose, while Richard became someone they couldn't afford to keep. The boardroom where it all began now felt different to Marcus as he presented the quarterly strategy that would reshape his company's approach to innovation. 2 years had passed since James had stolen his presentation and claimed credit for his work. James was no longer with the company, having been quietly reassigned to a role with no strategic importance after a pattern of unreliability and interpersonal problems had become impossible to ignore. But this wasn't a story of revenge, it was a story of transformation. Marcus had destroyed his weak self systematically and deliberately. The weak self that trusted without verification, that shared information without considering how it might be weaponized, that prioritized being liked over being respected. In its place, he had built something far more powerful, a professional identity that was immune to manipulation because it was founded on strategic thinking, documented excellence, and carefully cultivated relationships based on mutual value rather than naive trust. The man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others because he has learned to see the world as it truly is rather than as he wishes it were. This transformation requires letting go of comfortable illusions about human nature, workplace dynamics, and the rules of professional engagement. It means accepting that some people will always operate by different moral standards and that dealing with them effectively requires strategic sophistication that matches their own. But this transformation goes far beyond simply learning to defend against toxic behavior. It involves becoming someone who naturally commands respect, who builds genuine influence through competence and reliability, and who creates value for others while protecting themselves from exploitation. The truly undefeatable person doesn't need to fight toxic people directly because they operate in a different league entirely. The strategic mindset, thinking like Machiavelli. Developing a truly strategic mindset requires understanding several key principles that Machiavelli identified centuries ago but that remain relevant to modern professional and personal relationships. The first principle is that perception and reality are often different things, and both matter. Toxic people excel at managing perceptions while their targets often focus only on reality, putting themselves at a significant disadvantage. Sarah learned this lesson during her campaign to counter her manipulative colleague, David, who had perfected the art of appearing helpful while actually being destructive. David would volunteer to assist with projects and, then, create subtle problems that made his colleagues appear unreliable or incompetent. His offers of help were genuine in appearance but harmful in reality, creating a perception of being supportive while actually being sabotaging. Sarah's strategic response involved managing both reality and perception simultaneously. She began accepting David's offers of help while creating systems that protected her from his sabotage. When David volunteered to assist with client communications, Sarah would thank him graciously while also following up directly with clients to ensure messages had been delivered accurately and completely. When he offered to help with project coordination, she would assign him specific, well-defined tasks while maintaining oversight of critical elements herself. This approach accomplished several strategic objectives simultaneously. It maintained the appearance of collaborative teamwork, preventing David from claiming that Sarah was uncooperative or territorial. It allowed Sarah to gather evidence of David's actual behavior versus his stated intentions. Most importantly, it protected Sarah's projects and reputation while exposing David's true patterns to anyone paying attention. The strategic mindset also involves understanding what Machiavelli called the principle of preparation. He observed that the lion cannot protect himself from traps, and the fox cannot defend himself from wolves. One must therefore be a fox to recognize traps, and a lion to frighten wolves. This means developing both the cunning to recognize manipulation and the strength to resist it when recognized. Michael applied this principle while dealing with his supervisor, Karen, who used emotional manipulation to extract additional work from her team. Karen would create artificial crises, claim to be overwhelmed with responsibilities, and appeal to her team's sympathy to get them to work overtime solving problems that were often the result of her poor planning or procrastination. Michael's preparation involved developing what he called emotional armor, the ability to respond to Karen's emotional appeals with sympathy but not action. When Karen would claim to be overwhelmed, Michael would express concern for her well-being while asking specific questions about workload distribution and priority management. When she would create last-minute crises, Michael would offer to help develop systems to prevent similar situations in the future rather than simply working extra hours to solve immediate problems. This preparation transformed Michael's relationship with Karen because it removed the emotional hooks that her manipulation depended upon. She could no longer count on his guilt or sympathy to extract additional work, forcing her to either improve her planning or find other targets for her manipulation. Advanced psychological dynamics. Understanding advanced psychological dynamics is crucial for dealing with sophisticated toxic individuals who have refined their manipulation skills over years or decades. These individuals often use complex psychological techniques that can be devastating to unprepared targets but lose their effectiveness when properly understood and countered. One of the most sophisticated techniques used by advanced manipulators is what psychologists call intermittent reinforcement, where positive and negative behaviors are mixed unpredictably to create psychological dependency in targets. Jennifer experienced this during her relationship with her business partner, Robert, who would alternate between treating her as a valued colleague and subjecting her to criticism, exclusion, and professional sabotage. The intermittent reinforcement created a psychological dynamic where Jennifer became focused on earning Robert's approval and avoiding his disapproval rather than focusing on objective business outcomes. When Robert was supportive and collaborative, Jennifer felt relief and gratitude that reinforced her desire to maintain harmony in their relationship. When he was critical and dismissive, she would work harder to regain his favor, often accepting responsibility for problems that weren't her fault. Jennifer's recovery from this dynamic required understanding the psychological mechanism at work and consciously breaking the conditioning that had developed. She began evaluating Robert's behavior based on its impact on business objectives rather than its emotional impact on her. When Robert was supportive, she appreciated it but didn't allow it to influence her professional judgment. When he was critical, she evaluated his concerns objectively rather than assuming they were valid simply because they came from him. Breaking free from intermittent reinforcement also required developing alternative sources of validation and feedback. Jennifer began tracking objective measures of her performance, seeking feedback from clients and colleagues outside her partnership with Robert, and generally reducing her psychological dependence on his approval. Another advanced technique used by sophisticated manipulators is reality distortion, where they gradually shift their target's perception of what is normal, acceptable, or possible. This technique is particularly insidious because it happens slowly over time, making it difficult for targets to recognize that their standards and expectations have been compromised. Thomas experienced reality distortion during his employment with a company where the CEO, Patricia, had created a culture where abusive behavior, impossible demands, and ethical compromises were normalized as high-performance standards. New employees would initially resist the toxic culture, but over time they would adapt their expectations to match the dysfunctional environment rather than maintaining their original standards. Thomas's resistance to reality distortion involved what he called external calibration, regularly comparing his workplace experiences to objective standards and healthy workplace cultures. He maintained relationships with professionals in other organizations, read extensively about workplace culture and leadership best practices, and generally kept himself connected to perspectives outside the distorted reality Patricia had created. This external calibration proved crucial when Patricia began pressuring Thomas to engage in questionable business practices that she framed as necessary for competitive success. Because Thomas had maintained connection to external ethical standards, he recognized these requests as inappropriate rather than accepting them as normal business practices. The art of strategic communication. Mastering strategic communication is essential for implementing Machiavellian strategies against toxic people without compromising your own integrity or reputation. Strategic communication involves saying exactly what you mean while managing how your words will be interpreted and used by others. Elizabeth developed this skill while dealing with her colleague, Mark, who had a talent for twisting conversations to create conflict and confusion. Mark would misquote colleagues in meetings, take statements out of context in emails, and generally weaponize communication to create drama and position himself as a mediator or problem solver. Elizabeth's response involved developing what she called defensive communication protocols. She began documenting important conversations in writing, using precise language that couldn't be easily misinterpreted, and copying relevant parties on communications to create transparency and accountability. When Mark would try to engage her in conversations about colleagues' performance or behavior, Elizabeth would respond with carefully crafted statements like, "I think it would be more appropriate to discuss performance concerns directly with the individuals involved rather than speculating about them in their absence." This response accomplished multiple objectives. It declined to participate in gossip while appearing professional and ethical. It suggested that Mark's approach was inappropriate without directly criticizing him, and it created a standard for professional communication that made Mark's behavior appear unprofessional by contrast. Strategic communication also involves understanding the difference between public and private communication contexts. What you say in a meeting with multiple witnesses has different implications than what you say in a private conversation. Elizabeth learned to tailor her communication style to the context while maintaining consistency in her core message. In public settings, Elizabeth would speak in ways that demonstrated her professionalism and competence to witnesses while protecting her from having her words twisted or taken out of context. In private conversations, she would be more direct about addressing problematic behavior while still maintaining professional standards. Building unshakable confidence. Perhaps the most important element of becoming undefeatable is developing unshakable confidence that is based on competence, preparation, and realistic self-assessment rather than ego or delusion. Toxic people succeed partly by undermining their target's confidence and making them doubt their own judgment, capabilities, and worth. David learned this lesson while recovering from a toxic relationship with his former business partner, Lisa, who had systematically undermined his confidence through constant criticism, gaslighting, and professional sabotage. After their partnership ended, David realized that he had internalized many of Lisa's negative assessments and was operating with severely compromised confidence in his own abilities. Rebuilding unshakable confidence required David to systematically rebuild his relationship with reality. He began gathering objective evidence of his professional capabilities through client feedback, project outcomes, and peer assessments. He sought opportunities to demonstrate his competence in contexts where he could receive honest feedback and recognition. More importantly, David learned to base his confidence on preparation and competence rather than external validation. Instead of seeking approval from others to feel confident, he focused on being thoroughly prepared for every professional challenge and continuously improving his skills and knowledge. This transformation in the foundation of his confidence made David immune to future attempts at confidence undermining. When toxic individuals would try to make him doubt his judgment or capabilities, he could reference his objective track record and current preparation level rather than relying on their assessment of his worth. Unshakable confidence also requires understanding the difference between confidence and arrogance. Arrogant people are actually insecure and defensive, making them vulnerable to manipulation through flattery or criticism. Truly confident people are secure enough to acknowledge mistakes, accept feedback, and continuously improve without feeling threatened. The network multiplication effect. Advanced practitioners of Machiavellian strategy understand that individual tactics, while important, are far less powerful than systematic network effects that create sustainable advantages over time. Building and maintaining strategic networks requires understanding the long-term dynamics of professional relationships and value creation. Patricia learned this lesson while building her defense against her toxic supervisor, William, who used divisive tactics to prevent his team from organizing resistance to his abusive management style. William's strategy involved keeping team members focused on competing with each other rather than supporting each other, making it difficult for them to recognize patterns in his behavior or coordinate responses. Patricia's network building strategy involved creating value for colleagues while simultaneously building a coalition of mutual support. She began organizing informal knowledge-sharing sessions where team members could learn from each other's expertise. She created systems for sharing resources and information that made everyone more effective at their jobs. She generally positioned herself as someone who made others more successful rather than someone who competed with them for limited resources. The network Patricia built served multiple strategic purposes. It provided her with allies who could witness and validate her experiences with William's behavior. It created information flow that made it difficult for William to manipulate individual team members through selective information sharing. Most importantly, it demonstrated Patricia's leadership capabilities to senior management who were evaluating potential replacements for William. The network multiplication effect also extends beyond immediate workplace relationships to include industry connections, professional associations, and strategic partnerships that provide both opportunities and protection. Patricia began attending industry conferences, contributing to professional publications, and generally building her reputation outside her immediate workplace. This external network proved crucial when William attempted to damage Patricia's career prospects by providing negative references to potential employers. Because Patricia had built relationships throughout her industry, she had multiple sources of positive references and professional opportunities that were independent of William's influence. The legacy transformation. The ultimate goal of implementing Machiavellian strategies against toxic people is not simply to defeat specific individuals but to create lasting transformation in yourself and your environment that prevents future toxicity from taking hold. This requires understanding the systemic factors that enable toxic behavior and working strategically to change them. Marcus achieved this transformation over the course of 3 years as he built influence within his organization and gradually changed the culture that had allowed people like James to thrive. Marcus's approach involved identifying the specific organizational weaknesses that toxic individuals exploited and systematically addressing them through policy changes, cultural initiatives, and leadership development. One of the key weaknesses Marcus identified was the organization's tendency to reward individual achievement without considering the methods used to achieve results. This created incentives for people like James to advance their careers through manipulation and sabotage rather than genuine value creation. Marcus worked with senior leadership to develop performance evaluation systems that included measures of collaboration, team building, and ethical behavior alongside traditional productivity metrics. Marcus also identified communication and information sharing gaps that toxic individuals exploited to create confusion and manipulate perceptions. He developed systems for transparent communication, documented decision-making processes, and regular feedback that made it difficult for manipulative individuals to operate effectively. The legacy transformation also involves developing other people's ability to recognize and counter toxic behavior. Marcus began mentoring junior colleagues, sharing his knowledge of manipulation tactics and counter strategies, and generally building organizational capability to deal with future toxic individuals before they could establish themselves. This transformation created what Marcus called cultural immunity, an organizational environment where toxic behavior was quickly recognized, effectively countered, and ultimately eliminated. New employees with toxic tendencies found that their usual tactics didn't work in this environment, forcing them to either change their behavior or leave the organization. The philosophical foundation. The ultimate foundation of becoming undefeatable is developing a philosophical understanding of human nature, power dynamics, and ethical behavior that allows you to navigate complex relationships while maintaining your integrity. This requires grappling with the same questions that Machiavelli addressed. How do you maintain ethical standards while dealing with unethical people? How do you build power without becoming corrupted by it? How do you protect yourself and others without becoming what you're fighting against? The answer lies in understanding that strength and ethics are not contradictory but complementary. The truly ethical person must be strong enough to protect themselves and others from exploitation. The truly strong person must be ethical enough to use their power constructively rather than destructively. This philosophical foundation requires accepting that the world contains people who operate by different moral standards and that dealing with them effectively sometimes requires tactics that feel uncomfortable to ethical individuals. But it also requires maintaining clear boundaries around what tactics are acceptable and ensuring that strategic behavior serves ethical objectives rather than replacing them. The man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others because he has learned to see clearly, think strategically, and act effectively while maintaining his core values and contributing positively to the lives of others. This transformation is not about becoming invulnerable to all harm or conflict, but about becoming someone who cannot be manipulated, exploited, or diminished by toxic individuals. The weak self that enables manipulation through excessive trust, emotional reactivity, and strategic naivety must be systematically dismantled and replaced with strategic awareness, emotional intelligence, and competence-based confidence. This process is difficult and, sometimes painful, but it results in a level of personal and professional effectiveness that makes previous vulnerabilities seem almost incomprehensible. The final victory. The conference room was silent as the quarterly results were presented, showing record-breaking performance across all metrics that mattered. But the real victory wasn't in the numbers, it was in the transformation that had made those numbers possible. An organization that had once tolerated and even rewarded toxic behavior had become a place where such behavior simply couldn't survive. Marcus looked around the room at colleagues who had learned to recognize manipulation, document their contributions, build strategic alliances, and generally operate at a level of professional sophistication that made them immune to the tactics that had once made their workplace a battlefield. They had not become cynical or manipulative themselves, they had become strategically aware and ethically strong. The toxic individuals who had once thrived in this environment had gradually left, finding that their usual tactics no longer worked and that they could no longer extract value from others without contributing value themselves. They had been replaced by people who understood that true power comes from building others up rather than tearing them down, from creating value rather than appropriating it, from leading through example rather than manipulation. This transformation represents the ultimate victory over toxic behavior, not just protecting yourself from manipulation, but creating environments where manipulation cannot succeed. The man who destroys his weak self and builds something stronger in its place becomes a force for positive change that extends far beyond his own protection and success. The legacy of this transformation is an understanding that strength and ethics are not just compatible but essential to each other. The ethical person who lacks strategic thinking and practical strength cannot protect themselves or others from exploitation. The strong person who lacks ethical foundation becomes part of the problem they set out to solve. But the person who combines strategic sophistication with ethical clarity becomes undefeatable not through invulnerability to all challenges, but through the ability to navigate any challenge while maintaining their integrity and contributing to the greater good. This is the true Machiavellian ideal, the person who understands power well enough to use it wisely, who sees human nature clearly enough to respond effectively, and who remains committed to ethical objectives even when using sophisticated tactics to achieve them. The weak self dies so that something stronger and better can be born. The person who emerges from this transformation cannot be destroyed by others because they have learned to build rather than tear down, to create rather than appropriate, and to lead through competence and character rather than manipulation and fear. They have become someone worth following, worth trusting, and worth emulating, not because they are naive or weak, but because they are strong enough to use their power for good.